Okay, so I'm clicking record and we're going to start. So today we have the pleasure of hosting Richard Robin, professor of Russian in the Department of Romance, German, and Slavic languages at the George Washington University, who will talk about CMT, a fascinating topic that we all deal with in our daily lives. So Richard, go ahead. I'm recording. I'm going to mute myself and we will post this recording on our website in case you cannot stay throughout the meeting, in case you have class. Thank you, Richard, for joining us. Thank you, everyone. I'm muting. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I am going to put up a link which you can go to and you can stick somewhere on your screen. This is basically what would have been the PowerPoint for the presentation. I don't like doing PowerPoint, so everything, my life revolves around Google Docs. So this is a Google Doc and you can sort of follow along. And that way it'll force me to not read off the Google Doc entirely. So the first thing to talk about is, well, I guess I should poll the audience. And what I'd like to do is to start by asking, do you guys know how CMT works? Because knowing how it works it gives you some hint as to how you might use it pedagogically. So let me just poll. I don't want to explain things that people already know. No hands are going up. Okay, so the standard model that used to be used by computational linguists to try and create machine translation would be, let's feed the computer all of the rules. We feed the computer 100,000 words, we're done, and the computer just spits out sentence after sentence after sentence. Well, it doesn't work, of course, because let me ask you this. Have you ever heard of the sentence, time flies like an arrow? No, not. It's a very famous sentence because normal machine translation, normal CMT that is not statistically based cannot handle it, because does it mean time flies like an arrow, like we all know what that's supposed to mean? Or does it really mean take your watch and time those flies as an arrow would time them? Or does it mean the species of flies called time flies love arrows? So there are too many ambiguities, too much disambiguation to be able to depend on a computer model for computer translation that is based on rules and lexicon. This doesn't work at all. As a matter of fact, when one of the chief engineers at Google Translate came up with a statistical model for translation, he is famous for having said, every time I fire a linguist from my staff, my translations get better. So the statistical model of translation works like this. Let me just get the coffee out of the machine here. The statistical model works like this. Since Google has amassed almost everything that's ever been written in the world, including all of this copyrighted material that it can't release, but it has, it's already digitized it. So all Google has to do is to look for translations, and there are tons of translations. So something that's been translated a lot, Google can say, let's say that you want to translate, I'm going out onto the playground. The first thing that it's going to look for is, can I get all of those words somewhere translated? Has that sentence ever been translated before? Nope, hasn't. Okay, what about go to the playground? Has that been translated? Yes, that's been translated. I want to go. Has that been translated? Yes, that's been translated. So putting together things that have already been translated and looking for the most used versions of that translation, Google can piece together a guess at what the proper translation is going to be, and it's usually right. Now, the more information, the more data Google gathers, not only Google, but anybody else who does this, any CMT device, the more data they gather, the better the translations become. I often check Google Translate to see if they've gotten some of my latest favorite phrases. So about 5 years ago, beam me up, Scotty. Nope, couldn't do it. Today, well, those Star Trek scripts are all on the internet, and Google is just gobbling them up and looking for the translations. Well, Star Trek was a show that was shown on Russian TV, so they've got translations for it, and all they have to do is compare. So Beam Me Up, Scotty is now part of the Google repertoire. So the translations get better all the time. By the way, Google is not the only resource. If you look at the sheet that I put up there, we have several resources. And the DEEPl is actually the one that I like the best. Take a look at DEEPl because it really does a very good job. If you need really minor languages of the former Soviet Union, you'll go to Yandex. And then there's Reverso Context, which is a little bit different, works differently from the others. Reverso Context finds pieces that have been translated, shows them to you, and lets you pick the best. It just shows you everything that it can. And you might see one translation repeated 8 or 9 times with 8 or 9 different sources, and then another one repeated 2 times with 2 sources. Well, you're going to go with the one that's repeated the more, assuming you can understand the context. So Reverso Context gives you all of that context that you would want as a foreign language learner. So you're looking for in the statistical model, you look for the biggest gob of words. Then you try the next biggest gob of words, and all these gobs are called engrams. Are you familiar with Google's Engram viewer? No, this is a fascinating site. You just Google Engram or Engram viewer. And let's say that you want to find out when the word cosmonaut came into being, when it started getting used. The Engram viewer searches through all printed books, not journals, unfortunately, not magazines, not popular literature, just books. And it will show you the rise of the word cosmonaut, how it rose to heights in the 60s and then began to fall. And now it's falling even more because we don't talk about cosmonauts that much anymore. So it's a really fascinating offshoot of the Google Translation project. So that's how it works. It doesn't know grammar, or it doesn't know grammar well. You can test for this. You can take, so Russian, of course, is a language that has a lot of case endings, and you can make up some name that could never appear in Russian, like Mimi Mabala, and have it translate something with that name where that name appears as the direct object, which requires a different case ending. And you'll see whether Google does this or not. If it does, then someone has triggered in some sort of grammatical trigger for that because it's never seen that word before. It has no idea of how it would be translated. It knows it's a proper name because it's not in the translation database, but it doesn't know, it should not know grammatically what to do with it, but it does, as it turns out. So if students know all of this information, they can now begin to piece together how they might properly use a CMT machine to help them translate stuff either into their own language or into the target language. Now, is CMT good to use? I don't think people will object if I suggest that most of the time teachers try to discourage the use of CMT. So let me poll the audience. What if students hand you a pretty well-written composition, a third-year student, let's say, in whatever language you're teaching, hands you a composition, and it's clear that some of it was borrowed from a translation bot? Do you remark to the student that this is not a good way to go about learning language? I see some, yeah, some people are saying no, they agree with me, and some people say yes. I love using translation bots, things like CMT, as pedagogical tools. Now, it does not work with bad students, but nothing works with bad students. So we're talking about students who have some sensitivity to language and who have a great deal of motivation. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to build in that motivation and not just have them plop it into DEEPl and then come out with a translation and plop it down into Word and hand it into you. So if we're talking about first year, I would urge students in first year, and I do urge them in first year, not to use CMT, except maybe to look up a word or two, and then only in Reverso Context where they can actually see the context. But that they don't have enough language yet to use something like GT or DEEPl or Yandex. Here's how I enforce that. First of all, I don't know where everybody in the audience is about handing in things online. In Russian, we discourage, well, I discourage people from doing things online because in Russian, we handwrite. And even in all the way up until the later stages of high school in Russia, students are expected to handwrite. People handwrite a lot more than they do in the United States. And no one prints. A lot of Russians can't print block letters. So it's perfectly logical for us to have students handwrite stuff. Well, handwriting stuff means you can't just copy paste. You actually have to sit down and handwrite it out. In the first, for anything in first year, when I see it's coming off of a translation bot, I say, that's fine under one condition. If you copy it, you must learn it. It will be on your next test. Now, keep in mind that I don't know in your languages how many students you have per section. In Russian, it's not very big. A section of 10 is pretty normal. So let's say that 3 of those students try to turn to a translation machine to do some sort of part of their assignment. Well, it's clear when they've done it. And it's just a matter of taking whatever they gave you, sticking it somewhere in a database with their name in it, and then plopping it down on the 3rd page of a 3-page test and say, oh, by the way, you said the following, and you give them the English equivalent, say it again. Well, that will either make them learn it or drop it. So that is a self-solving problem. You can make it self-solving. So I'm not crazy about translation bots. There's not too much. Even someone like Robert Godwin-Jones, who's a big proponent of students learning to use the raw internet by themselves. No one is suggesting that a first-year student go out and use a CMT for a large chunk of text. But let's talk about third-year students. They're supposed to be writing in paragraphs, and they're supposed to be writing for writing. So it's one thing when you assign something in first year that's a writing assignment. It's usually some sort of realistic assignment, like write a note to your roommate that you're going to be late, or it's personal correspondence. It doesn't matter whether it if it's error ridden or not. It only has one reader at the other end. All of these assignments, there are lots of textbooks that have assignments that say, write a typical advertisement for a place of interest in your town. I always laugh at these assignments because you're not going to get any realistic product out of students. They can't do this. They don't know the language of advertising. This is silly. And it sort of is demeaning in a way. So I would rather have them do realistic things. Well, how do we get third-year students to write for writing in cogent paragraphs in a way that resembles their own writing in English? This is where we can use CMT with a couple of provisos. And these are very important provisos. I'm going to pull up this sheet. Hold on here. So I'm going directly to the writing section. I've skipped a bunch of stuff. I'm going directly to the writing section. When we look at pedagogical approaches to writing in upper division courses, first of all, some of the material has to be tested. You say, whatever you give me, a certain amount of it, I'm going to test, and you can negotiate with the students on how much you're going to test. You can say, okay, you use this phrase, I want that into your repertoire. You use this, I want this in your repertoire. I want this, and that's a matter of negotiation. I think that if you really want students to learn stuff, one of the ways to do that is to make them, even in third year, copy it out by hand. What you copy out by hand will stick with you to some extent, because there's some extra motor skill going into that, and you're not just cutting and pasting. You're actually experiencing those linguistic, that linguistic output that you're doing. The most important thing, I think, is actually sitting down with students who do this and telling them, you have to actually sit down with me and we have to go through how you would edit this. You're going to get a translation. It's going to be pretty good, but it's not going to be right. And you're going to be dealing with questions that you normally don't get to deal with at this third year level, because they're too worried about, did I get the word right? Did I get the verb tense right? Those problems are now solved. Not only are they solved, but you can actually point them out to the student. Look, this is how this was done. You want to say this. Look what the solution was here. But in addition to that, you can say, now you have a pretty good paper here. it's cogent, it's grammatically correct. For the most part, it's going to be grammatically correct. But it's going to have those English features that the student built in through paragraph structure and through syntactical structures, through word order, for example, through the use of in English, we write in the active voice. But in many, many languages that we teach, passive voice is very common. This gives us a chance to start attacking those issues right now at a very low level. Because they take a long time to master. If you look at people who come up and speak whatever the target language is at, let's say, advanced or advanced high, their writing usually lags behind because they can't get the register necessary for whatever they're speaking at. Writing is very unforgiving. There's no intonation in writing, and there's no repair in writing, which there is in speech. So a person can be an advanced high because they're good at repair and they're good at talking around stuff, but in writing, you're not allowed to do this. In writing, every mistake counts against you. There's no good accent to make you, to cover up the fact that, oh, you have a glaring ending problem there. We have to teach students to address some of these issues. Now, I've taken examples from Russian, and I think they're fairly typical for a lot of other languages taught. And I see two people who, it appears that you guys teach Chinese, right? Probably none of this applies to you. 3 people? Yeah, 4 people. Oh, wow. I have no idea. You know, in Chinese I was going to talk a lot about compression problems because most languages are decompressed. Nearly all of the languages of the Middle East, whether they are Semitic or Indo-European, are very decompressed. That is, for every English word, you need 3 of the words in the target language. This is true for most of the European, and it's very true for Russian. Chinese is more compressed than English. So I don't even know how you would deal with that in terms of writing. And I'm not sure, to tell you the truth, you guys can tell me, how good are the CMT machines for Chinese? Because the last time I checked, they were pretty awful. Not good. The reason I ask is that I know that whenever I try and do CMT for Chinese, my daughter lives in Taiwan. So I'm often finding stuff that I want to send to her, and I have to translate it back. And this problem with the fact that everybody's name is a common noun is a real problem. So I'm intending this for an audience that in fact is experiencing very good experiences with CMT for themselves. So for example, and the reason I push this so much is that when we tell our students, don't use CMT, it's almost as if we are parents from the 60s who smoked 10 cigarettes every day, or 10 packs of cigarettes every day, saying to our kids, don't smoke, don't smoke, don't smoke. Come on. We use these machines all the time, admit it. All right. Well, if we use them, why should we prevent our students from using them? We should teach them how to use them. That's the main argument. So for Russian, this means teaching use of the passive voice, preference for the passive voice over the active voice, or it means teaching decompression, because a CMT machine is going to give this translation to you in a way that sounds more or less correct, except it's going to sound much too telegraphed, and you'll have to untelegraph it in your target language, unless, of course, it's going into Chinese. There are most languages, again, I don't know about China. Well, Chinese doesn't make much of a difference between the parts of speech, but most languages love nominalizations, and we love verbs. And we have to teach students to prefer nominalizations. And I'd really like to hear from those of you who teach Chinese, what would be your pedagogical issues in preparing students to be able to use. Is it realistic to have students use CMT to produce to produce communication, that is to produce output, because I'm doing this presentation backwards. I went immediately to writing, but then I'm going to go back to reading in a second. Can I open the floor for that, just for a brief discussion on that?
I think for Chinese, Google Translate has become much better over the years, definitely. And actually, I don't think there is a big difference how we use. I mean, the language is different, but I also encourage higher level students to use it, because students are trying to express more complicated ideas, and if they don't have Google Translate, sometimes they just can't even get started with that. And I'm very
much in agreement with you. I'm extremely agree with you, because
and then the first year student, usually I do not encourage. I say it's okay to look up some very concrete nouns, and verb and adjective are usually no good. And everything, if you want to translate, have to put in context at least minimally a phrase instead of just word. But there are 4 other Chinese instructors here.
Have you worked with Reverso Context, and do you like it?
English to Chinese, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, I think they are pretty good. I think one thing you mentioned about the decompression, it's a little bit complicated in Chinese, because there are different stylistic Chinese, and then we also have more written style, more written style that tend to be more condensed, more compressed language, but we have like vernacular, more daily colloquial type. And depending on what fit into the Google Translate, sometimes students will get something very different. So all of a sudden, in the English to Chinese translation, you'll see like a student's essay, if there's 3 paragraphs, one of the paragraph is very formal, and the other 2 is kind of how they talk normally. So there is a stylistic issue that I think might be concerned by.
Yeah, obviously one of the pedagogical interventions that you would want to effect is to teach students to recognize register, right?
Right, so it becomes like they do the English to Chinese translation, and then if that paragraph become very compressed because it was more written style, very formal speech, and the other 2 paragraph is very colloquial, then we'll help them decompress into more the style that match the other paragraphs.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very informative. I'd like to turn, if I could, a little bit to reading, and make some pretty radical suggestions. You can follow it, you can scroll the document up. I'm not scrolling it up because I'm sort of talking off the top of my head, but there are 2 types of reading. There is reading that is for the extraction of information, and that's usually reading for professional purposes. Then there's reading for the development of language proficiency, whether it is for the development of global proficiency, just adding into getting input. It's a way of getting input into the language, or it could be reading for the purposes of developing the proficiency of reading per se. Now, let me address the question of professional purposes first. I'm going to make, I don't know if this is going to be a radical solution for you all or not. It's time to stop teaching reading for professional purposes. This is silly. If I am a sociologist interested in Russian villages on the Volga, chances are, if some of those villages are not on the Russian part of the Volga, but on the Kazan side of the Volga, on the Tatar side of the Volga, then I'm going to need to know some Tatar, which is a totally unrelated language. And it would take me as long to learn to read Tatar as it would if I were to start from 0 and learn to read Russian. So it's silly to assume that by teaching someone to read at, usually in most universities that I know of, graduate programs, that's for the advanced level. In other words, to read a simple news story. Come on. I would argue that since I've done tests, I've done research on this, and believe me, if you throw anything into GT anything, you will understand it at the advanced level without difficulty. Even in language that GT doesn't handle very well. It doesn't do well with Urdu. It doesn't do well with Tajik. Still, it's enough to understand the gist and main details. Well, that's what the advanced level is all about. So if that's our requirement, we're silly to, I mean, it's sort of like asking people who measure things not to use calculators. It is not, you are not morally superior just because you have learned the language that you need to read for your narrow specialty, which has nothing to do with the language per se. Now I'd like to find out if anybody wants to argue with me on that. Okay, well, we can do away with that requirement, except that GW still has it. Let's
Richard,
talk.
I think Antonio has a question.
Yes.
No, I didn't want to argue, but I was actually very interested because, you know, it is a provocative suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
And in my, I teach Italian, I should remind, and I'm one of those teachers who sometimes I teach reading for graduate students, which is, as you say, you know, we work with, typically we give them like, you know, a crash course on all the grammar and then work on the text specifically to the discipline they're in. And your idea is actually, I mean, I never thought about that. I mean, now it seems like quite a bit of a waste of time, and all of a sudden I'm wondering if we should do that. So I'm not going to argue with you, but I mean, I would like to explore it more. I don't know if this is the right time because the topic of this presentation is another, but well, just thank you. I will be thinking about it and perhaps suggest some changes in my department.
Let me tell you, Antonio, when I first realized this, I'm a very dedicated language teacher. Everybody should know 10 languages. It broke my heart to come to the realization that to require these non-language specialists to be able to read these languages is a waste of time. It broke my heart. But logic is logic. There's no reason for them to have to do this unless they are dealing with, let's say, medieval Italian, which is, you know, in that strange font that no one can read, but by then it would be Latin anyway. Yeah. So, you know, and if it's normal text and Google can scan any text, you can hold your phone up to it. You know, I've tried experiments to see if I can get to fool Google into not being able to read the text. So since Russian is written in Cyrillic, I would type a sentence in Cyrillic using all of the Cyrillic letters that looked like English. I would use the English letters for it to see if I could trick all of the CMTs into not recognizing the language, because these were tricks that you could use if you were going to prevent students from trying to read something into Google. Well, guess what? It doesn't work. Google's smart enough to figure it out. So I think we ought to give up on that count. Now, as to whether we should have students dump texts into Google that they're supposed to read for educational purposes. First of all, can you prevent them from doing this? You can make it harder. You can create a text that is either on paper, which they would then have to photograph. You could try and make the font strange enough so that it would it would be rendered incorrectly. This usually doesn't work. It used to work. It worked 5 years ago. It no longer works. Any student who really wants to get the text into translatable condition, into transferable condition, will be able to do that. The question is, can you make it so much trouble that it's not worth it? For short texts, you can. So if you keep your text on paper, scanning page after page after page for, let's say, a long text is too much work. Unless they find the text online, then it becomes very easy. Now, will they do this? I'd like to poll the audience. How many of you believe that your students are dedicated enough not to resort to machine translation if it is made available to them? No one. Okay, we're all realists, right? I was a,
Depends, Richard, if I may.
yes,
If
yes.
we're
I'm with you.
talking about basic language programs, not many. If we're talking about advanced courses, many are quite dedicated.
Third year students.
Basic language program, no.
Oh, so third year is for basic. For you is basic.
Yes.
For third year for me is this intermediary year when
It is
sort
in
of-
the basic language program, but it's the intermediate low level. So
here's what usually happens in Russian, and I wonder to what extent this happens with other languages, and I wonder whether well, let's see. In Russian, usually what happens with the really good students who are A minus students, there comes a time when they're in third year, they hit this language plateau, nothing's going in, I can't learn anymore, I'm stuffed. And then somewhere in April, right before the end of the year, many of them just, it's as if you know My Fair Lady, I could have danced all night, you know, where suddenly it's there, they can say almost anything. They can't say it nicely, they can't say it beautifully, they can't be very precise, but they can talk on almost any topic they want. And this is this wonderful feeling they get. And those students are dedicated, and they're the ones who are going to get the most out of using CMT. Now, that means that they are going to, they might not agree to read everything that you feed them in a textbook, because they can go out and pick and choose whatever they want to read on the internet and throw it into, they're going to throw it into CMT to see whether they were right. They're going to throw it into CMT to see whether that word in that context means what they thought it meant. Why shouldn't they do this?
I think Antonio had a question. No? Okay, so-
I'm so sorry. I raised my hand. It was a mistake. I apologize.
Okay. So I was told that I had a half hour to present. That is basically everything that I wanted to tell you. My heartfelt suggestion is that this is a wonderful tool, especially Reverso Context. These are wonderful tools for dedicated students who will be willing to sit down and look at a text and see, okay, where did I go wrong in either interpreting this text, or how can this be said better? Many of these students will compare CMT machines. So a student will write it in DEEPl, then write it again in Google, and then check a word in Reverso Context. You want students to do this. I would hope that teachers would do this. I would add one more thing. For some students, obviously, if you divide a class in half and you say, here are our A minus students, maybe our B plus students, and then there are the rest of the students, the other half of the class. And of course, they're going to abuse these tools. The way that you could prevent some of that abuse is by testing putting some of that stuff on tests. Say, okay, and you have to keep a database of what students have written. So you have a database of what they've written. You said this, say it again. Now, I'll tell you, I've done this, and I'll tell you what the results are. The weak students stop using those bots because it becomes too much work. Now, I had not realized that all of my audience would be, none of my audience practically would be Russian speaking. I had prepared a whole bunch of examples of this wonderful writing that these students do when they use CMT. And what I have found is, to a large extent, when I review their papers, these are students who are in third year. They're all in third year. They're just beginning to write in real paragraphs that are not things like how I spent my summer vacation, because no one's interested in how they spent their summer vacation. They're interested in their ideas, and usually we can't begin to address those ideas because, well, I should back up and say, in Russian, the language is so grammar heavy. All of you who are used to this idea of communicative approach and let's not deal with the grammar that much, all of this goes out the window in Russian because you can't move 2 steps in Russian without putting an ending on something. And if you don't put the endings on, you can't make yourself understood. So we do a lot of grammar, and we are told by the language teaching community, you should not be doing grammar. At our own professional meetings, we say, yes, we should not be doing grammar, and then we go right ahead and do that because we have to. And so when I grade third-year students' papers, I find myself, under normal circumstances, addressing only language issues and not addressing whether the student has said anything cogent in a way that is interesting. Now, suddenly, I can address issues that are not purely linguistic. I can address, stylistic issues, but I can also say, why do you think this? I can have a conversation with that student. And I can have a conversation at a pretty high level. So what's better, to have a conversation about silly things at a low level, where the student really can't write anything that's interesting, or to have a conversation with a student who is being helped along by this support from CMTs, where there's actually some communication. We all feel better, take my word for it, or try it out yourself. We feel better when we're actually having some sort of substantive conversation with these students. Now you might wonder, can you ever withdraw the crutch? Yes, eventually you withdraw the crutch, not in third year though. You're planting seeds for 2 years from now. You're planting seeds for when they actually are in country and using the language in some sort of professional capacity. Yes, I see a hand up.
Yeah, can you hear me? I'm sure I'm
Yes.
on different, okay. So I totally agree. I teach French, and French has so many different registers. So, you can remove the crutch, but I'm, a superior level speaker. I'm not native, but like when I do certain kinds of formal letters or some legal things that I have to write about, I actually do need to go into Google Translate or something like that just to see the format.
Yeah.
And because I don't teach in that, I don't live in that register. I don't live in that kind of world. So, even at higher levels, we still sometimes, I think, do need that crutch. But I mostly teach French 1, so we don't want it there at all.
I would like to use your question as an opportunity to push another related but extremely controversial claim. Plagiarize. So if I have to write something in the formal level in Russian, let's say an official, one of these official letters of introduction to, I actually think I could do that now on my own, but when I was not at my current level, the internet was young, but it was old enough, it was developed enough that you could find examples of letters of introduction or examples of this or that, and I would just download them and copy them and play fill in the blanks, cut out this phrase, put in that phrase. And I encourage my students to do that. And whenever I get up at conferences and say, I encourage my students to copy off the internet, because when I do that, I make one very important proviso. It's the same proviso that I talked about just now, which is, if you copy it, you must memorize it. It must become part of your language repertoire. There is nothing wrong with plagiarizing if it is not for nefarious purposes. You're not trying to pull one over on me. You're trying to acquire repertoire in this language. Well, there's nothing wrong with plagiarizing for that purpose. After all, when we listen to people and we pick up words, we pick up their phraseology and we start using that, that's oral plagiarism. Well, that's what we want people to do. Well, we want them to do it in writing too. As a matter of fact, I would go even further. I would say you should get all of your friends to help you write your composition, your native language friends. And once they write at a level that's too high for you, it is your job to go through and pick out all of the words that aren't appropriate for your current level, get rid of them, replace them with words that are at your current level, and that act will teach you those words. They will stick.
Richard, one clarification. You are suggesting using these tools in third year, right? Because I might have confused it with third semester.
Third year and up.
Right?
Yes.
So students are typically in Russian at intermediate level in the third year?
So well, let me speak. I can give you the Ben Rifkin figures, or I can give you my figures. The Ben Rifkin figures are that everybody in third year is intermediate mid to intermediate high. I think that's optimistic. I think that third year is basically an intermediate mid in speaking, and maybe intermediate high in writing, but that's hard to say because we really don't look at writing from the standpoint of proficiency. In other words, from what I gather, not by doing formal surveys, but from when I talk to colleagues across the country, for the most part, writing at the third year level in Russian, which is a category 3 language, and of course the languages that I see up there are pretty much category 4 languages, but for category 3 language, they are speaking at intermediate low coming in, intermediate mid coming out, and writing basic subject, object, verb sentences, or subject, verb, object sentences throughout, and with a lot of grammatical mistakes and not very clear as to what they want to say, or if it's clear, then it's very simple, like I have a nice dog. And I'm not sure that that's a good way of conducting the third year writing program. In other words, is writing just a support for speaking? Now, I'm very much for it. You do a presentation, right? A third year is the year of presentations because we want to move them from the intermediate level to it. We want to head them towards advanced. So we're going to have them do a presentation, paragraph speech. They get to plan it out, and they usually write out what they're going to say beforehand, right? And then they present it without the notes, or they present it just with, a PowerPoint or something. Am I wrong? This is a usual, format.
The reason I was asking is because we have representatives of different departments here. I see Spanish, Italian, Chinese, French. I don't know if there are any other Asian languages here, so it'll vary for us. I was also going to ask, the examples that you give in your presentation, those paragraphs in Russian, what level are those?
Oh, you would be, guess.
I don't know.
Third year.
Third year.
Third year. Now, it's not all, those are good students, so they're the intermediate highs in the third year.
Okay.
At GW, half of our students at the end of third year are intermediate high, half are intermediate mid, and a slight, tiny percentage that gets penalized are intermediate lows. They lose a plus minus grade on their grade for that. If you're intermediate high, you get a plus, you get a little plus. In other words, if you had a B, you get a B plus. If you had a B plus, you get an A minus. So for the intermediate highs, they're the ones who are usually very good at writing, at leveraging CMT in their writing.
I see. There is also a Korean here. Antonio, do you have a question?
Actually, this time it's not a question but a comment, because I teach Italian for Italian and the media, and I use a video by Umberto Eco in which he makes a controversial statement that somewhat reminded me of yours. He says, students are gonna copy from the internet. There is no way around it. But so I tell them, yes, you can copy, but you have to use a certain number of sites different. And this hope was that they would be able to develop critical abilities and recognize, because typically they go to one site and they copy and that's it. Whereas it's okay, you can copy, but you have to have at least, I don't know how many. And then hopefully you can, distinguish what's worth and what is not. So yeah, it is I agree with most of the things that you are suggesting, I think. And by the way, it's true, like since I use it, like Julia was saying, I use Google Translate because, I am a level of, I teach languages, and so I know how they work, and so I can figure out if it works or not. So why should the students not use it? With guidance, of course. The risk is that they feed the text and it comes out in Italian, and that's really not what we want, especially at the lower level. So anyway, thank you, but not a question. I'm sorry, it was just a thought.
I'm very interested to find out about different languages because I'm so used to, I also check Spanish quite often because occasionally I teach Spanish. And of course, there the problems are very different. And I wonder if this affects the population that we're talking about. Of course, in Spanish, it's the default language. So you get lots of unhappy students taking Spanish. There are
Yeah.
no unhappy students, I suspect, taking Chinese. They know what they're getting into, right? Students who take Korean, they know what they're getting into. And I would argue that students who take Italian probably want to take Italian because they have some interest in the target country. Otherwise, they would be taking what? Spanish. So
Well, it goes back to what you were saying about motivation, right?
right, it goes back to motivation. So you have lots of unhappy students taking Spanish, and they're going to just plop down whatever they see in the translation pot, and nothing is going to save them. So you're talking to a much narrower contingent of students in that Spanish class. And I apologize if there are any Spanish teachers out there. Look, I taught Spanish, but let's face it, the contingent that takes Russian and the contingent that takes Spanish, as we say in Odessa, are two differences. And you know, you just can't compare that. I don't know that I would be giving this presentation to an audience of Spanish teachers.
Well, we have a few here. Andrea, Andrea, Mariana, David, there are a few people.
Yeah, I mean, what up with Spanish? Come on, we have plenty of students who are thrilled to be taking this language.
I was
Live
thrilled to be
in Los
taking-
Angeles.
I
mean-
was very thrilled to be taking Spanish, but where I teach, it's the default language, and half the students don't want to be in that class.
Well,
Half.
I think also, I mean, at USC, we have the language requirement. And so that would be true of many languages, I think, just because students have to take some language. Okay, so maybe Spanish is the default to a certain extent, because I think it's going to be easier than Chinese.
Of course they think it's going to be easier.
Yeah, but that said, I have plenty of students who are really happy to be learning Spanish.
When I taught Spanish, half my students were happy to be there. But when I teach Russian, they're all happy to be there.
That's what you'd like to think.
Occasionally you get a student who didn't realize what sort of doo-doo that they were about to step into, okay? This happens. And then they always want to stay. You know, no, I really want to learn Russian. And you're saying, no, take something a little bit less challenging. But usually students know what they're getting into.
You cannot say, how can you say it's less challenging in what sense? I mean, learning a language is challenging, period. Okay. And so maybe we don't have to spend
number of hours needed to master the language to a superior level.
Right. Okay. I know about all those categories and all of that business.
Right,
I mean, I don't know
that-
everything in detail, but I understand how those categories exist. But I'm just saying that learning and mastering a language is difficult across the board.
It's true, but most of your students, I would argue, probably started in high school.
No, not necessarily. Well, possibly.
So they're already starting from some position, whereas it's very rare for me to get students who have had previous Russian.
Right. Yeah. I see that.
Now, my advantage is that you probably get students whose only language learning experience has been Spanish, or who are starting Spanish as a first language, first foreign language. Whereas for most of my students, Russian is a second, third, or fourth foreign language. So they already know how to learn foreign language.
That's interesting.
I don't know about Chinese. Are Chinese learners, do they come to Chinese from other foreign languages, or is this their first experience with a foreign language?
I think some of them, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I keep speaking for Chinese. We have so many instructors here. Some of them already know Spanish or fulfill their requirement with Spanish, and they come learn Chinese, or they will learn Japanese and Korean in our department.
Because I started Russian in college from Spanish in high school, and Spanish was very helpful. But I can't imagine how it would be helpful in Chinese. You guys don't have grammar.
Well, no, we have very heavy grammar, actually. We just don't have a lot of.
You don't have
conjugation.
endings. You don't have endings. When I say grammar, I mean endings.
So our word order is very important because that's how we do our grammar. So
Are there any other comments? We have a few more minutes before we finish this very interesting and a little controversial topic. Andrea?
Yeah, so I'm just wondering how you keep track of like these phrases that your students use and how you plot them into a quiz or a test, or
Right.
because that seems like it
Yes.
involves a lot of customization and
It involves a little bit. It's not that much. As I said, in the first 2 years of Russian, we don't allow our students to type at GW. And if there are any other Russian teachers out there, please, do you have your students type, or do you make them handwrite? Typing starts in third year. So computer entry starts in third year. So in third year is when I start collecting this database of words. So I get everything that they write. Liana, do you teach? What's your handwriting
teach Russian
situation?
at USC. I teach Spanish at USC, but I can tell you that my child who goes to a Russian school is not allowed to type. They all
Right. It's a very handwriting culture.
years, yes.
But starting in third year, they type on the computer. So I get an electronic, in third year, I don't want to see a single piece of paper. This has nothing to do with pedagogy. This has to do with the fact that I lose paper. And it's a miracle that I can get all of the paper back to my my students in first and second year without losing it. So they hand everything in electronically. I now have a record of every word that they've written. And when I make up their test, I have at most in a third year section, at most 10 students, maybe in a very heavy year, 12 students, but it's usually like 10. So I make up the test. The test is 2 pages long. Page 3, I make up 10 different page 3s. It's not 10 different page 3s, because keep in mind, half the class is not going into, is not using CMTs because they're too afraid to use it, because they're too lazy to use it. But half of them have tried to use it, and they may have used it successfully. And where they've used it successfully, I'll say, in your last essay, you said, and I'll quote it in English, and I'll say it again, and I'll see if they learned it. And this will be on material that we have agreed that they should learn, because in third year, they're using so much from CMTs. They're not just using a phrase or two, they're using a lot. And I'll say, I want you to learn this. I want you to learn this, this, this. And it's not random, it's frequency and the appropriateness for the current level of writing that they are now engaging in.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're running out of time now. Thank
You've
you
been a
so
great
much.
audience. You've been really, really informative. I've learned a lot.
Well, it's been very interesting, and we all learn languages still, right? So it's also useful for us as CMT users. So thank you so much. It has been very interesting. And everybody else, thank you so much for joining. We'll see you soon. We have another event coming up soon. This recording will be uploaded to the CLC's website, and we'll continue to experiment with CMT. Thank you all so much.